Hi, Year 11. So, the best way I thought for me to give feedback on this essay was for me to read through the beginning of one of the essays and to um, talk about the things and comment on the things that I liked, and then tell you how the essay could be improved, or just the paragraph I'm looking at. Um, so, this kind of question, when you get it, how are the younger generation presented in an Inspector Calls, is kind of a bit trickier than if they just ask you a question about one of the characters, because obviously what it's asking you to do is weave together your interpretation of more than one character, but not just those characters. So by talking about Gerald and Eric and Sheila, who are the younger generation in the play, um, automatically you're probably going to start comparing them to the older generation characters. So um, always when you're asked about a specific character, obviously you are going to talk about the other characters in the play, but this question I think can be slightly more difficult to structure, just because you've got these three main characters that you need to be talking about. And then, as well as character, you're also going to have to be commenting on the wider themes in the play. So if we start with their short introduction, I'm not going to dwell on this too much, because I think that introductions are something that students can get slightly too bogged down with. It's something that we'll come back to slightly later in the year. But this student's introduction says that I believe that in the play and in spectacles there's a drastic difference between the older and younger generation. In my opinion, the younger generation are more understanding, sympathetic, and have more left-wing views, unlike the rigid capitalist older generation. So there's lots of phrases in there that I really like. It lays out quite clearly here by saying there's a drastic difference between the older and the younger generation. One of the key themes of the play, which is that contrast between the two. And you have to think about the fact that this obviously is constructed by J.B. Priestley. So why would he include three younger characters and then older characters to work as a kind of contrast? So it's nice that that's being pointed out, because that's going to be something that's going to, I hope, become clear throughout the rest of the essay. Then this again is quite a clear sentence of giving an overview. So this idea that the younger generation are more understanding, sympathetic, and have more left-wing views, unlike the rigid capitalist older generation. So I really like that contrast that's being picked out there between the two generations. Particularly that word rigid, I think that's a really nice way of describing the older generation. I would say what's missing from the introduction, and as I said, I'm not going to dwell on this too much, is starting to draw out the fact that this is a play. It is a text that has been constructed by a writer. So why is it that J.B. Priestley has set this play up so that you have this contrast between the two generations? So what you want to think about in an introduction is zooming out a little bit and thinking about what J.B. Priestley might have been trying to say by constructing these characters in this way. So I'm just going to write a note and I'll put it in red to remind you that you need to say something about J.B. Priestley's intentions. Because it's great to see these contrasts, but why is it happening? Why have an older capitalist generation and a younger left-wing generation? What do you think that J.B. Priestley is trying to suggest? Is he suggesting hope for the future? Is he suggesting that, the older capitalist class is going to die out and be replaced by a more radical younger generation? You need to think about what you think he's trying to say. Okay, I'm just going to talk through the first paragraph, but I'm going to just scroll through and show you the detail of this essay, so you can see, this is the kind of detail and length that you should be aiming towards for these essays. Okay, although Sheila and Eric are presented as spoilt and naive at the beginning of the play, they experience a huge character arc developing into more mature and understanding adults. This is shown by Sheila starting with, "I've been so happy tonight, I wish you never told me," and Eric ending with, "We all helped kill her." This shows the younger generation transforming from a self-obsessed character to a more understanding individual who's able to take responsibility when needed. Sheila, not wanting to know about someone's death she helped cause, tells us she prioritises her happiness over other people's well-being, and she's also presented as naive for not knowing of the brutal ways people die every day. She can also be presented as spoiled and used to her every wish coming true, as she has a habit of saying, I wish, which suggests her every desire usually comes true. At the end, both Eric and Sheila have taken responsibility for their actions, which reveals their maturity and want to be good. The pronoun we shows Eric taking responsibility of his own actions on behalf of everyone else that refuses to accept responsibility, which shows his growth as a person. The audience may be awed at how the characters have changed for the better in just one day. Priestley may have done this to show how easy it is to change and wants his audience to also change. Okay, there's a lot of really nice ideas in that paragraph. This is definitely a personal choice, but what this student has done is decided to comment on this character arc that happens for the younger generation, their development from being quite spoilt and naive, as I think those are fair descriptions of the characters at the beginning of the play. I think I'll come back to that in a second, because I think there is perhaps a bit more nuance that you could bring in there. And the idea that they become mature and understanding. Okay, yes, I know what you mean, but I might ask a question about the word mature, because it's quite interesting, isn't it, that aren't the adults in the family supposed to be mature? Aren't they, the ones with the life experience, the older generation? So, isn't there a comment to be made there about the fact that we're viewing, by the end of the play, the younger generation as being mature, and the parents as being kind of naive or immature? So I just think there's maybe a comment to be made, comparing this with the older generation, because I think that word mature in the context is quite loaded, isn't it, because you have this contrast between the two generations. The choice that they've made is fine. It's not incorrect to write an essay where you kind of comment on the beginning and end of the play in one paragraph. I just think maybe in terms of developing your argument, there is an argument to say that if you really focus on the beginning of the play and pick out the evidence. So at the moment it's quite light touch. So we've got, I've been so happy tonight, I wish you never told me, from the beginning of the play, but we've kind of missed out. So we've said that they're spoiled and naive, but then actually we haven't put in a quotation that supports that view. Okay, so if you're going to say that the characters are spoiled and naive, I want evidence that links to that point, from the beginning of the paragraph. And yeah, this idea of the younger generation transforming from self-obsessed characters, again, I think that's a really nice phrase to describe them. But it kind of, to me, this paragraph reads a little bit like an extended introduction. So rather than developing the arguments about what the characters are like and how they're presented at the beginning of the play, it feels still like too much of an overview. So I really like these phrases about the characters, but I kind of want a bit more evidence from the text and exploring how this kind of character arc happens, because what I think needs to be commented on for the beginning of the play is the fact that this doesn't happen by their own accord, does it? It's the role of the inspector in the play that makes them understand they're kind of spoiled and they're naive, and that they're part of this capitalist class that has, like this student says, basically got away with being able to, turn a blind eye to the brutal ways that people are dying. So that's a really nice phrase. But again, perhaps there needs to be here a mention of the class of these characters, because it's not people who are dying brutally every day, it's working class people. And that's the point I think that J.B. Priestley is trying to make. So I don't want to kind of go into too much detail here, but I think I'm just going to write some notes at the bottom to make it clear what I want this paragraph to do. So number one, make sure that all points are adequately explained with evidence from the text. And so the one that I've pointed out here about the characters being spoilt and naive at the beginning of the play, I need to see the evidence of, you know, that statement. You're trying, remember, to convince me to agree with your interpretation of the play. And if you're kind of jumping, you know, to and fro with looking at the beginning of the play and then at the end of the play, that might not always be the best way to really state your argument clearly. I think it's really, really important to comment on the fact that there is this very noticeable character arc for the younger characters, although arguably not Gerald, in a way that for Mr. and Mrs. Burling there isn't. So actually you could argue maybe that Mr. Burling starts pretty much in the same place that he ends the play. So make sure all your points are adequately explained with evidence. And then I'm going to say as well, think about how you want to structure your essay. So you don't have to have your essay structured in a way that's kind of covering Act 1, then covering Act 2, then covering Act 3, because rightly you might want to kind of comment on that contrast, but I just feel at the moment like this paragraph is saying too many things and I want one key idea. So I think probably that's the best way to phrase it, is you want one key idea per paragraph and you need to argue that idea in full. You know, if I can kind of pick through and ask questions about what you mean, I think it's kind of clear to say that perhaps you haven't extended your points enough. And I think particularly thinking about themes such as class, okay? Think about all of the big themes in the play, class or the or gender, for example. So all of the ideas in here are really valid, but I think the way that they have been structured makes some of the ideas a bit too light touch. I want you to go into more detail about what you mean by what you're saying. I'm hoping that by having talked through this paragraph, that's going to help you to edit one of your paragraphs. If you're really, really stuck about which paragraph you should pick, then leave me a comment and I can give you some further guidance on your essays. But I would say that overall, the biggest bit of feedback for everybody from reading your essays is this idea of having really clear points. Okay, your arguments are more important at this stage than, you know, going into depth with lots of language analysis or unpacking, you know, one verb in lots and lots of detail. I would much rather that you had a confident and kind of individual interpretation of the play, and that you kind of thought very, very carefully about the strongest points and the strongest evidence from the play to convince me of your argument. Okay, take care.